The edges of land and water are nearly infinitely variable, from the canopied woodland streams to the bay marsh islands to the full-on ocean beaches. There's no scene along the edge more elemental than the annual spawning of horseshoe crabs that mass in Delaware Bay during the full and new moons in May and June. The importance of the horseshoe crabs is for several species of birds, ruddy turnstones, knots, plovers, and other shorebirds, many of whom are migrating during the spring from as far south as the Argentine, some going as far north as the Arctic. A lot of these birds come into Delaware Bay shores coincident with the deposition of all these nutritious eggs, and they've got very little body fat. They're exhausted, and they will spend a couple weeks pecking at the beach, fueling up on eggs, critical to making the last stage of their migration. So this is one of nature's great spectacles, these clouds of migrating birds synchronized to the crawling out of these ancient horseshoe crabs, dependent on their eggs to fuel the rest of their journey. If you arrive at a spawning beach on the full or new moon in May, when spawning tends to be heaviest on the highest tides of the month, for a few hours after low tide, as the tide begins to rise, you'll see nothing out there. Then as the tide gets within a few hours of high, you began to see the tails go back and forth, males sort of cruising back and forth, waiting to intercept females. Then a couple hours from high tide, and these big females, which are 2 or 3 times as big as the males, began barging ashore, and the males, with their special little clasper attachments, are hooked onto their shell. Females began to come up the beach, depositing eggs, hauling the males over the eggs to fertilize them. A few at first, then more and more, some coming in upside down if there's waves, but righting themselves with that tail. And then within an hour of high tide, sometimes for miles, the whole beach looks like it's paved with cobblestones, these dark brown creatures. And no sound in the scene except the whisper of wind, the soft burble of waves just sloshing on the beach, and this kind of clicking, clacking, scraping sound of chitin on chitin. That's what their shells are largely composed of. And at that point, you realize you're in a scene that looks just pretty much like it looked 400 million years ago. Sun, moon, sand, wind, water, these ancient creatures. It's about as close as you can get to stepping into a time machine and going back close to 500 million years, when trees and grass and dinosaurs were still a long way from existing. A very elemental look at the planet, and you can see it every May in the 21st century on the shores on the edge of Delaware Bay.
This is probably the largest pelican colony north of Oregon Inlet, North Carolina, and it may be one of the largest ones in the United States anywhere. We're south of Smith Island, Maryland, in Virginia, and this is where the islands of Chesapeake Island and Shanks Island used to be, but they have been sort of migrating to the east and merging with the salt marsh here. So those two islands are essentially gone, and this is a nice vast stretch of Spartina alterniflora marsh and needle rush. And this beach is quite similar to an ocean beach. It has some growths of the same kinds of plants, including sea rocket. It's isolated. There are probably hardly any predators here. There's also plenty of marsh and water and tidal guts that are full of the fishes that these pelicans like to feed on, which are primarily menhaden. They get the menhaden by flying in the air and then plunging down into the water, plunge diving, and scooping them up in their big pouches. Then they go and feed them to the babies. The babies swallow the fish whole. This is one of the first places I nested in Virginia. I did a count of what I consider the birds that are capable of flight, and that includes some sub-adult birds that aren't ready to breed yet. They're probably in their second or third year of birding. And my rough estimate is 1,130 brown pelicans capable of flight. That's a lot of birds, and there's probably a lot more that are out feeding right now that haven't come back to the colony for the night. This has been sort of the bedrock of the pelicans in the Chesapeake.
This is an example of where the river starts. This is the earliest portion of the whole watershed where the land really begins to create the rivers. This first order stream, this small stream issuing out of a spring. The spring issues out of the groundwater. The groundwater is in there because of the soft, pervious forest floor. This whole system, you try to see it as a continuum from the top of the ridge to the bottom land like we're standing in, to the spring, to the stream, to where the stream grows bigger, to where the stream enters into and joins the main stem river, where the river widens down into tidewater and events to the bay. You look at the land and eventually as you decrease in elevation you get little springs, little seep like we're looking at across the other side of this. Many little seeps up and down the drainage are the heads of the river. There's no real such thing as one head of a river. This golden club that grows in this little mucky bend of this creek, this is generally thought of as a good indicator of water quality. And why not? The head of the stream is just a couple of 100 yards up there, and it's come out of the ground where it's been filtered through the entire leaf litter. This is where the production of the land comes to the edge of the water first. This is where the nutrients of the land enrich the water. These little streams like this, the small streams that are still in the forest, so small that they're covered by the canopy, on a national basis, those first and second order and even smaller make up over 75% of all the stream miles in the country. In Maryland, like 17,000 miles of streams. 3/4 of that, roughly, is going to be in the length of streams like this. This is where the land first produces the edges of the river, the beginning of the bay.